Um,
Okay, we should be recording now.
Okay, can everyone see? Sometimes. Okay, cool. All right, so welcome to a joint meeting of the Vermont Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the Interagency Committee.
Oh, Kim, I think you muted yourself.
I'm
I'm
totally
sorry.
muted. I've been talking this entire time. I apologize. Welcome to a joint meeting of the Vermont Environmental Justice Advisory Council and Interagency Committee. We thank you all for being here. Here are our community agreements. I think Victor is joining us. Hey, Victor. So we'll just give everyone 1 minute to review these, think about them, and then we'll move on. Here is our agenda for today. So today is all about the baseline spending reports. We're really excited to have each IAC member share about their report. We know that this is something that's really important to the advisory council. So what we're going to do is we'll take about 15 minutes to do an introduction to the presentations. And so Amy and Jenny are going to be leading us in that, which is exciting. And then from there, we'll transition into the actual presentations. So each IEC member will take, between 5 and 10 minutes. Doesn't have to be that long. It just depends on how much content you're sharing. But we have a specific order, and that order is in the agenda. So for the first hour of the presentations, we'll do 5 agencies and then use the rest of the time in that hour for the AC to ask questions. We'll take a break and then we'll come back to finish the second half of the presentations, take a break, and then talk about next steps. So that's what we have planned. All right. So here's I can't see everyone, so if anyone has a question or anything like that, please just raise your hand or come off mute. So here's our reintroduction. We're going to go over the baseline spending report deliverable, just really high level so that everyone is familiar with what we're talking about today. We'll talk about the purpose of these presentations and then also go through ANR's Agency of Natural Resources baseline spending report cover letter that we created and submitted to the advisory council. And now I'm going to stop sharing and have Amy take over and go through a couple of slides.
Thank you, Kim. Gosh, it's so nice to be with everyone this morning. Jenny, I didn't know if you wanted to give a kind of like quick reintroduction of the deliverable first, and then I'll share. Does that feel good?
That sounds great. I'd be happy to jump in. I'm
Awesome.
Jenny Ranis. I'm General Counsel with Land Use Review Board, which is one of the interagency committees for the EBS, for the environmental justice stuff. So I'm a lawyer, so I love to go back to the statutory language of stuff, and I'm just going to use the 6004, the statute, as a basis for sort of explaining how we got to this deliverable and what you're going to hear about today. But I do want to emphasize that there's just miles and miles of space between the base statutory language of what the legislature handed us and how we got to these final reports today. And I think that the whole goal of this presentation is to show you guys how we get there, how each individual covered agency sort of had to approach this problem differently, and our efforts to really incorporate the advice that we've been getting from the advisory council and sort of help you guys get to know us better. So a lot of different things. So the original implementation of the EBSG spending that we had to implement state policy by September 15th, 2025, there was a deadline for providing guidance to the advisory or to the covered agencies on doing that. In order to accomplish that, they put together an EBSG focus group that spent the last, I want to say, year and a half meeting regularly to try to understand definitions of terms and how to apply this idea of contemplating how our spending is directed or can be directed or is impacted to environmental justice focus groups. So we really use the EBSG focus group to set definitions and expectations. Our most recent deadline was the February 15th, 2026 deadline on the baseline reports. And that's what the advisory councils received last month, that package of reports from every covered agency and the cover letter kind of introducing them. And the goal of the baseline reports is to talk about where investments have been made, who received those benefits, trying to quantify what benefits have been received as an outcome of those investments, et cetera, and generally setting the stage for how the financial side of environmental justice works for the various agencies. I'll just flag that we have some more next steps coming up that you'll be hearing more about, which is that in July, under the statute, by July 1st, 2026, the legislature has set a goal for us to direct our investments proportionately within our environmental justice populations. That obviously causes or requires a lot more than just the direction of financial investments. We have to identify those populations. We have to do our mapping, lots of other things going on. And then ultimately, starting on January 15th of 2028, the covered agencies will be submitting annual reporting, building off of the baseline reporting to show sort of trends and where our financial information is going. So that's the really blunt, high level explanation of what the world of environmental benefit spending guidance is looking like. And then I'll pass it over to Amy for some less dry ways of explaining what we've been up to for the last year.
Oh my gosh, that was great. Thank you, Jenny. Okay, I am going to share slides again. See where this comes up. Just get to the slide. Okay, don't worry, this is not a blank slide, but to frame up the IEC baseline spending report summary presentations we're about to see, I'm going to very humbly provide the AC with an overview of the cover letter, the environmental justice and civil rights unit prepared to accompany, excuse me, our reports. So information for the cover letter, which gives a summary of the limitations and challenges we faced while preparing these reports, was gathered by the EJ and Civil Rights Unit over the last 2 years at public meetings, the environmental benefits spending guidance feedback sessions, during task group meetings, office hours, and one-on-one meetings. So additionally, the EJ and Civil Rights Units tracked AC concerns and questions, which also informed the cover letter. So in short, the cover letter is like a qualitative summary of patterns they have heard over the past year. And I think it's important to note that I wanted to share this overview today because when I first read it, I felt like really heard and seen in the experience I was having as an AAC member trying to prepare the report for the health department. And it also brings together the agency's kind of like a collective experience into one place. So yeah, I feel like it's an important document to kind of go over together. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give kind of like the high level patterns that are in this cover letter. So let's see. First, the content of the cover letter, maybe many of you have already seen it, is really about the limitations and challenges that they were hearing over the last couple of years, namely quantifying environmental benefits. So this is content from the cover letter mostly. So the environmental benefits spending guidance did not provide guidance on how to measure these benefits or define the ultimate purpose of the exercise. Environmental benefits can be expressed in many ways, such as dollars saved, people served, energy conserved, or pollution reduction, for example. But without clear guidance from the General Assembly, agencies made assumptions about which units of measurements are most appropriate, introducing a lot of uncertainty and inconsistency. So I'm going to give some even more specifics that are in the cover letter that were heard over the last couple of years as we prepared these reports, namely financial systems. So across the state of Vermont, agencies use different financial systems for distinct purposes, which are not necessarily comparable. And as I learned, many of the systems are not set up for analyzing environmental benefits at a system level. For example, at the Department of Health, we use a system called Zahara, and there's no searchable fields for environmental benefits. There's a lot to say about each one of these, but I'm just going to kind of give a brief high-level overview that is named in the cover letter. So the next one is staff capacity and resources. Data gathered across multiple programs within an agency is labor intensive, and many agencies lack dedicated staff to conduct the level of analysis indicated in the statute for the reports. Adequate staff capacity is necessary not only for the reporting, but also for ongoing analytical work needed to meaningfully inform decision making. Also in the report, we have data gaps and inconsistencies. Covered agencies collect data in different ways, shaped over time by legislative, federal, and program-specific requirements. Existing data collection practices were not designed to support the implementation of the VTEJ law. As a result, agencies would need to develop new data fields, tools, and processes to fully align with the law's reporting and analytical requirements. Also in the cover letter is a specific section for some agencies that had like unique challenges. I don't know, Jenny, if you want to come back on Mike for a second to kind of explain a little bit about this one.
Well, I think what the Land Use Review Board and the Public Utilities Commission encountered very early in this process is that the environmental benefit spending guidance assumes that agencies have discretion in how they disperse funds, how they receive them, how they direct them, et cetera. And you'll hear more from both me on behalf of the LURB and the Public Utilities Commission later, but we work in a very, very different way. And so basically coming up against a wall immediately saying, we don't have discretionary funds. How do we still address the concerns and meaningfully participate in this exercise was a huge challenge for the board and the Public Utilities Commission. But Elizabeth Schilling, I welcome you to jump on if you want to correct, or you can explain more when we get to your point in the presentation. So,
thank you. Great. Okay, we're going to hear more about this. Just pause, Kim, is that okay? Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to just keep moving through here. Another section in the cover letter is about interpretation and utilities. So the reports are not comprehensive accounts of all agency spending. Rather, they represent a thorough effort to identify and document environmental benefit investment consistent with existing data and capacity. So those are the main sections, but before we leave this, I want to also say that one of the greatest takeaways that I think we have learned from engaging in this process is that while there are many limitations and challenges in creating baseline spending reports, inherent in the limitations and challenges are also a lot of opportunities for change. As I'll share in just a second for the health department, our report doesn't capture the number of like really fruitful conversations that were happening and the ideas generated. So I think it's really important to just name that there are a lot of opportunities for change that have come from this process. Okay, moving on. Okay, so we're going to move into agency presentations. So during the presentations, as Kim was saying, IAC members will share takeaways from the baseline spending reports, which will hopefully highlight for the AC kind of, among other things, the inner workings of the federal and state climate right now that we're working in, and that we have been working in, inherent complexities of translating laws into actual deliverables that Jenny named, and also where there's like alignment and possibilities for moving forward. So these are some of the things we're hoping the AC members and all of us can take away from today. So here's the first group, the order of the first group that's going to go. And as you'll see, you're not quite done with me because I'm going to kick this off. Before I do, I want to pause. Kim, Juliet, Carla, do you have anything to add in framing up our time together in these presentations? Did I miss anything?
No, you did beautifully. So thank you. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Kim. I don't know if the camera is going to turn towards me, so I guess I'm just a disembodied voice, but I wanted to share for AC members who didn't see the email communication, the reason why we are having this as a focal point today is because specifically Mariana saw the reports and was like, it would be super helpful to get maybe like a high level or plain language summary of what these reports entail. So this is our best effort to, speak to that specific request from Mariana. And although she's not here today, we'll certainly reach out to her and send her the meeting recording so that she can get that information, despite, I think she's still in Argentina. So she's hopefully having fun. That's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Juliet. Okay, I am going to kick off the presentations with a really short overview of the main takeaways. I want to acknowledge Kim, Juliet, Carla. I took a template as just a one slide to share. Also to my other agency IAC friends, there's no one way to present. So whatever you have prepared will be perfect and beautiful. So no visuals are needed necessarily. Okay, so the mission of the Vermont Department of Health is to promote the health and well-being of all Vermonters by providing equitable opportunities for health, advancing health equity, and preparing for health emergencies. I think starting these presentations it makes sense to me because I think our report and process really embodies all of the cover letter limitations and challenges and the things we were dealing with and moving through this process. So it became very clear to me early on that doing a full exhaustive environmental benefits spending report was not going to be possible because we're not set up at a systems level to do it. So I worked with the department. I worked with program leads, division directors, and also our commissioner's office and our legal team to create a sample methodology. So I did that by doing quickly a program scan. The Department of Health has all our programs listed, just descriptions. So I started there, selected programs that likely had environmental benefit spending, had meetings with those programs, and then invited them to do what's listed here on step 2 to fill in a program inventory. Thank you to Abby and Claire and IAC members for sharing a spreadsheet that was made from the environmental benefit spending guidance. They turned that into a spreadsheet that then programs in our departments and agencies could fill out to try and see if they had environmental benefit spending. There was no data in that spreadsheet. It was just a vetting to see like which programs we might want to draw data from. So from that process of having about 20 programs that the Department of Health fill in this spreadsheet, and through having meetings and then having them fill in the inventory, I did an environmental benefits sample data. So 2 programs that had the capacity and data analysts offered to kind of mock up what this would look like if we did it at the program level. And you can see there's a quick data visualization here from the Health Disparities Grant on Indigenous food and cultural resource spending by county. So just a small part of that Health Disparities Fund. So that was part of it. Healthy Homes was analyzed, and then also a part of the Health Disparities funding. 2 other really quick things that I want to say in terms of the highlight of this process is that in the report, I added a section of notable environmental benefits spending trends. One of which at the Department of Health, much of our work is funded by federal grants, which have either been terminated or severely restricted due to executive orders. For example, the EPA, we had an EPA EJ grant that was terminated and had an impact actually on reducing my position to a half-time position. So these are not analytical pieces. We didn't analyze it, but it was like high level kind of like spending trends. And then lastly, as I was saying, in terms of opportunities in moving forward, we did have conversations about our next steps being to explore adding environmental benefits to an existing grantee inventory form. We don't know if this is possible, but one of the ideas in the conversations that we had was to systematize environmental benefits so we can do the annual reporting, was to use our department's performance improvement units grantee intake form, which does actually track some spending by investment location and priority population. So we want to explore the feasibility of adding environmental benefits to that inventory form so we can systematize this moving forward. Okay, that was a lot. I am going to be quiet. Thank you for listening, and I'm going to mute myself.
Thank you, Amy. That was wonderful. Let's give everyone just a minute to like recalibrate, and then I'll offer Jenny if you want to jump in again,
Sure.
and then we can move from there.
I just want to make sure any AC members who had any questions for Amy don't get cut off. Okay, I'm seeing a thumbs up, so I'm gonna keep moving. So now you're gonna see something that's totally like the opposite of what great information Amy just provided. So I'm putting the Land Use Review Board spending report in the chat right now. You'll notice it's incredibly short. It does not have any quantitative information. And so I think what's most useful is kind of giving everybody an explanation as to what my mystery organization does. I think we're not necessarily as well understood as a lot of other places, and that will help to explain our spending report. But understanding that land use and Act 250 and all that is really complicated, I really welcome anyone to jump in with questions, because if I'm moving too fast, it's not helpful for anyone. So interrupt away. The Land Use Review Board is the sort of successor board to the Natural Resources Board. And so for the last 56 years, we have been administering Act 250. Since 1970, Act 250 has been a land use review process that issues permits for large-scale development in the state of Vermont. As you know, we sort of I like to tell people we sit at the intersection of development and environmental protection. So it's traditionally been a quasi-judicial, I hesitate to even say agency, because it's been a very limited scope of work in the issuing of Act 250 permits and policy and throughout. So it's the Land Use Review Board is a creature of Act 181 from a few years ago. Our board we like to overuse the metaphor that we have been, with this new 5-person professional board, we've been building a plane as we've been flying it. Sarah Had, our vice chair, is here and can definitely attest to that. And Act 181 has added has massively changed the way our organization works. Traditionally, Act 250 is applied statewide, so for the most part, a square mile in Chittenden County is treated the exact same way as up in the kingdom. Act 181 creates a tier system for review, which very briefly requires our board to basically map out the state into different levels of tiers that will have varying levels of Act 250 review, depending on different factors like density and critical natural resources, et cetera. And I'm sure you've heard a lot in the news about how complicated and complex this is. Interestingly, Act 181 actually has some call outs to environmental justice in the board's tasks of determining where these different levels of review tiers are going to be. So it's been very important to really keep an eye on the environmental justice work as our board is sort of building us out into what I like to think of as more of an policy and directive agency than we have been in the past. So brain, sorry. So with all of that said, coming from a more quasi-judicial perspective means that traditionally Act 250 and our organization does not have any discretionary funding. All of our budgeting goes towards the staff that run the organization. We do not choose the projects that come to us for permitting. We don't approve or deny the projects based on greater policy other than whether projects satisfy the Act 250 criteria and that legal system. So we don't have discretion in pushing funds or projects or development in one direction or another. We're using a base like organization to make those determinations. We intake funds from the fees that are calculated by statute. They go to the general fund, and then the general fund administers. The general fund fills out our budget from there. So we frankly had nothing to report on the environmental basis. The other thing about the way our organization works is that we're very, very small. There's, I think, 34 of us right now, compared to a lot of the other agencies that are here. So we're very thin and lack a lot of those other of resources or like individual, we don't have our own mapping people. We don't have our own funding people. We don't receive or administer grants, all these things. So it's a lot of here's what we don't do. As Act 181 continues and the board's efforts moving us towards a tier-based jurisdiction system continue, that may change. We don't really know. We're in a huge period of transition right now. So we wanted to make sure that in our reporting that we were very open to the idea that in the future there are going to be ways for us to quantify our staff efforts in more directly into environmental justice categories, et cetera. So now that I've taken you down that wonderful rabbit hole, I'm just wondering if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, I can pass on to the next person. Thanks, guys. All right. Back to you, Kim.
Thank you, Jenny. That was wonderful. It's actually great to hear, to actually give you the floor to share more. And I hope advisory council members kind of understand more about what the LERP does. So thank you for that. So now, Agency of Natural Resources is going to go. So I'm going to share my screen again and then pass it to Carla.
Thank you. Okay. So Agency of Natural Resources, we are more traditionally what folks may think about when thinking about how environmental benefits are provided around the state. I suppose we're not, the LERP is quasi-judicial in nature. We are very regulatory in nature. And what we're going to do with this presentation is the Agency of Natural Resources has 3 departments. Each of the three departments provided their own baseline spending reports, and each of the departments underwent a process whereby they started by identifying environmental benefits. This process started about 2 years ago, and through the engagement of working group members within the agency that are these individuals who are specialized in doing and connecting environmental justice to their departments, they gathered insight and information from their staff regarding which programs provide environmental benefits of the kind that are listed in the statute. So really briefly, what we did at the agency is we captured direct investments that provide environmental benefits that flow to certain geographic areas, and also reported on where the impacts, where the benefits flow to geographically. I am also joined here by Megan Cusino from the Department of Environmental Conservation and Abigail Connolly from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. I don't know if Kate
is virtual.
Kate is virtual. Kate Everly from the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. I will provide a general overview of what the three departments reported on. And if there are any programmatic questions, these three folks here can answer any questions that the advisory council may have. But I wanted to provide what it is that we did and what is included in our reports. Next slide, please. Okay, the Department of Environmental Conservation. The mission is to preserve, enhance, restore, and conserve Vermont's natural resources, protect human health for the benefit of this and future generations. Based on the mission of the department, it is reasonable to conclude that almost all of the actions taken and the programs managed by the department fall under the category of environmental benefits. So the department identified an incredibly long list of environmental benefits, and then applying very strictly the environmental benefit spending guidance identified based on availability of data, the reasonability of accessing that information, and the capacity. The department reporting on 18 programs, which is an incredible number of programs. And these programs invested $160 million in communities and projects throughout Vermont. And these, again, are direct investments that provide environmental benefits. When you look at the spreadsheet provided in the report, you will be able to identify where geographically these investments occurred. 35 DC staff spent 165 hours over 18 months. We started having conversations 2 years ago. And an opportunity that the department has identified is that it will prioritize collecting data from other investments. And it is the desire of the department to address gaps in this baseline spending report conditioned on availability of funding, which is an underlying theme across all of the agencies. This is the Department of Environmental Conservation. So moving on to the Department of Fish and Wildlife, this is another department under the category of the Agency of Natural Resources. The mission of the department is to conserve fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the people of Vermont. Again, based on the mission, it is a reasonable conclusion that almost all, if not all, programs and actions taken by the department would qualify as an environmental benefit as defined by the statute. Therefore, the department also engaged very thoroughly the environmental justice liaisons from the department to identify which benefits of the long list of benefits identified in the statute were provided by the department. After that, an exercise of identifying direct investments that provided those benefits was underwent. And the conclusion of that thorough process was that the department reported 2 direct clean water investments totaling 187,000 approximately dollars. And the reason is that, as I mentioned earlier, the guidance identifies direct investments that the agency actually has the discretion to distribute funds. So an opportunity for the department that was identified is new tracking systems. As the Department of Health indicated, our financial systems are not designed to capture this kind of information. So getting to more direct investments, dollars that are spent providing environmental benefits, would require a different way of tracking this information. Next slide, please. Oh, I would also like to mention that the Department of Fish and Wildlife programs are the Watershed Grant Program and the Stream Crossing Structure Enhancements. So that's the program that deals with culverts, bridges, and dams. And then after further analysis, the reporting process concentrated in the Watershed Grant Program. And this is the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. Next slide, please. Sorry, this is Department of Fish and Wildlife. I read this heading here. Okay, so moving on to the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. The mission is to be responsible for the conservation and management of Vermont's forest resources, the operation and maintenance of state park systems, and the promotion and support of outdoor recreation for Vermonters and our visitors. You can see programmatically the effort that the department took to be able to gather the data that was reported on the baseline spending reports. After an incredibly thorough process, again, of identifying benefits and which of the programs invested direct funds to provide those benefits, FBR identified 4 programs that directly invested $8.3 million to communities and projects throughout Vermont. Again, due to the mission of the department, the majority of our programming within this department could be identified as providing environmental benefits. So then a thorough process was undertaken to identify which of these programs the agency has the discretion to distribute and are provided by direct investments. FBR also identified that additional funding and resources are needed to advance this work, and also the finance systems presented a challenge just because when these financial systems were created, we were not thinking about tracking environmental benefits and where they flow to in the state. I'm going to stop talking now. We have a few minutes left. The 3 folks from the 3 departments, Megan, Abigail, and Kate, are here for advisory council members. If you have any questions about the programs that are included in the baseline report, please feel free to ask any questions.
I know we just gave you a lot of information. So there will also be time to ask questions as well after you kind of mull everything over. Hey, Victor, you have a question.
Just a point of clarification. The spending that we are talking about between the 8 million and the 100 million and how that gets distributed, how is that in relation to the environmental justice map? Is that in relation to the map? And like where does that intersection happen? And I know there was discussion about um how we would be identifying those community groups in relation to that. I have also been This is my reintroduction to this, unfortunately, because I was out for medical reasons for a hot second. So this might have been covered. I might just not be up to date on it. But I'm wondering if there could be a point of clarity on how these relate to that.
Thank you, Victor. That is a great question, and one that many folks have asked and still remain sort of like a question that we are working towards a satisfactory answer, because the answer, unfortunately, is the order of operations established by the statute um, forces us to work on these deliverables at the same time. Ideally, we would have a mapping tool already created so that we can very easily identify the geographic areas where the environmental benefits are flowing to, so that we could have an accurate depiction of on the Vermont map, where the agencies are spending the dollars and which benefits are being received by which geographic areas. Because of the structure of the EJ law, we are working now towards the creation of that map, and found that in order to get us closer to the statutory intention, which is to be able to ascertain exactly where the agencies are spending dollars, and later on establish a goal of proportionality based on those expenditures. What we will do is, once the mapping tool is finalized, we will be able to create a goal of proportionality that is informed by accurate information that's going to be gathered through the process of the creation of the mapping tool. This is a lot of words. I hope I answered your question, Victor.
Yeah, thank you. I think Juliet has their hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I'm sorry that the camera is making me into like a disembodied voice, but hopefully you can hear me okay. The other part of your question, so like your question was kind of two-part, Victor. Obviously, Carla spoke to the mapping tool part, sort of how there's, the mapping tool isn't necessarily going to be available for use to help this exercise, at least not in the early stages. But the other part of your question was about, how would we go around identifying community groups that would receive spending, and that, the focus on proportionality and that kind of question. And I just wanted to highlight one of the obstacles, or I guess points of interest for all of us that we can work on as an AC and IAC, is that the environmental justice focused populations definition, as it's currently defined, applies to over 90% of the census block groups in the state. So in short, it is kind of a flawed definition if we want to be able to focus any of our work on, being able to identify target community, or target is a terrible word for that, focus communities, I guess, to be the beneficiaries of this work. So when it comes to identifying community groups, I think the first step would be to take a magnifying glass to that definition and figure out how can we improve it to actually function for the purposes of the law. But that's a big conversation perhaps for another day. I just wanted to flag it.
Thanks. Any other questions? Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, just because the order of operations was brought up, that isn't that also in the order, the redefining of the definition and
Yes.
Yes, it is.
It is, and technically, the it went by already. This is information that's been provided for some time. And I don't know if you remember that we had John Adams come to one of our meetings and provide like a depiction, a visual of what the definitions are capturing and what the definition applied to the state looks like. So yes, it is contemplated in the EJ law that the advisory council can make recommendations regarding definitions in statute.
I'll also just say, just because the deadline technically passed doesn't mean that, like, we could do that at any time. It's just a matter of taking the time to do it. So
I believe the statute identifies that every 5 years, it would be good for the advisory council to revise definitions. So it's an open invitation for the advisory council to apply to the definitions in statute what experiences they have and knowledge they have regarding the location and existence of populations that may or may not be captured by the current definition. Or in this case, because of the over broadness of the definition, perhaps it renders the definition obsolete in terms of what it is trying to achieve. One last thing I want to mention that I think it's important to contextualize this conversation regarding the baseline spending reports that the agencies put together is that this is a series of deliverables that the law established. The first one was for the Agency of Natural Resources in consultation with the Advisory Council and the support of the Interagency Committee to put together the guidance document that was gonna tell agencies how to put together these reports. Now, we provided the reports as per the statutory mandate, and those baseline spending reports include 3 years. And then the next deliverable, and this is Victor, relevant to your question regarding the mapping tool, the next deliverable in statute is to utilize that information to create a goal of proportionality. And that exercise would benefit greatly from having an environmental justice mapping tool so that agencies have the ability to analyze the data that was gathered in the baseline spending report and come up with reasonable goals that are based on data. Kim?
Okay, thank you for that. I'll just give a little more space in case someone else has a question. Okay, now we're gonna pass it to Bob to go over Agency of Education's report.
Okay, great. Hey, Kim, can I share the screen?
Sure, yeah, go
Okay.
ahead.
Great, okay. And can you all see the screen?
Thank you, guys.
Yes.
All right, good. So the Agency of Education, pretty much Amy framed it up pretty well. You know, we all had limitations in terms of maybe our accounting systems that all the agencies have. In our particular case, we focus on the discretionary grants, kind of as was alluded to earlier. The formula grants really have a specified distribution requirements with them. Therefore, since they're not under the purview of the AU to decide how they get allocated, we focus simply on our discretionary grants. So given that, then there was basically a query of the grants management system where we keep all of that financial data, and that generated 100 lines of reports for individual investments. And then the finance team went through all those investments and started to try and find, were there any keywords as defined by environmental benefits in Act 154 that were in the grant descriptions? And if they were, they were then extracted, and that is what constituted the basis of the report that was submitted. When you take a look at those findings, this table here summarizes by fiscal year the number of total grants that we administered and what percentage of those grants were in the discretionary category. So every year was basically hovering somewhere in the low 40% of what the grants were in the discretionary category that carried with them some kind of environmental benefit as defined in Act 154. And then when we further took a breakdown of those grants, the percentage for each of the discretionary grants by the fiscal year was very low that carried an environmental benefit. So for FY23, 6.75% carried an environmental benefit. For FY24, 7%. And FY25, less than 1% carried an environmental benefit. Oops, sorry. I think I clicked the wrong button. No, I guess that's it. So we don't have a lot to tell in that regard. The thing to keep in mind is the education spending that comes from the state is defined in statute. So it's not up to the discretion of the AOE how that education funding is allocated. That said, what everybody needs to be aware of is 2 of the 3 environmental focused populations, right? There's 3 environmental focused populations, the BIPOC community, English language level proficiency, and then some poverty metric. When it comes to education spending that's defined in statute, 2 of those 3 populations, a poverty metric is used and English language learner metric is used. And those students actually get a higher weighting in the per pupil education spending calculation than somebody who is outside of those 2 metrics. So therefore, we're actually doing disproportionate spending on a higher amount than having to worry about proportionate spending. So there's a good story to be told in that those that are in most need are actually getting already a higher weighting towards the amount of dollars spent on those students. So that's something to keep in mind. Going forward with the education transformation that's happening in the state, the foundational formula system is going to try and level set what is the education spending per pupil across the state so that there's equity across all communities. Higher wealth communities may be able to spend more per student. Lower or economically challenged communities may not be able to spend to the level that a higher income community can. The foundation formula is kind of try and level set that and said all communities will get a certain amount per student. Despite that, the weighting for those students that need extra care, which is typically tied to poverty level and then their English language proficiency, they will continue to get a higher per pupil weighting in the foundation formula system. So going forward, the Agency of Education is hoping there's an RFP out for a new grants management system. And in that new grants management system RFP, we're hoping to incorporate some sort of alphanumeric specifier that we can code any kind of spending that's tied to environmental justice benefit spending. So we can then do an automated query of it rather than do a laborious manual review of all the line items. So we're in the process of a reorganization in the Agency of Education. It's been going on for several months. And so there are going to be a shifting of work focus across the different groups. And once that all settles out, there'll be probably another representative on this IAC instead of me. It's probably somebody either from communications and or finance who can speak more towards the deliverables that are going to be moving forward more eloquently than I certainly can. So I will stop there. And if you have questions, just let me know.
Thank you, Bob. That was really helpful. The percentages also were helpful as well. Does anyone have any questions? Go ahead, Rich.
Bob, is there a simple explanation for the big drop off in percentages in the past year?
Yeah, yes, Rich, there is. Most of the discretionary spending was everything to do with COVID relief funding. In other words, the elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund that came from the COVID era, that had a 3-year, we had 3 years to enjoy that money, and then that came to an end. So all of the spending that was associated with the bulk of environmental benefit spending had to do with ESSER relief monies coming in.
Thank you. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Bob?
This is also coming from spending that is technically meant to be allocated in an environmental justice lens still, even though it's in the Department of Education. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is there a percentage of that funding for these schools that are kind of purposely meant to be allocated towards like infrastructural rearrangement to some extent? Like, for example, I know that Vermont has an increasing issue with PFAS contaminations and things like well water. I would imagine there are potentially some schools in Vermont that are not technically hooked up to town water that might now need a POET system, for example. Is this the kind of scenario for schools that this money can be allocated towards? And is there any guidance for schools on that spending?
Boy, we could spend the rest of the meeting talking just about that topic. So yeah, to your point, there are just staying current with everything that's going on with PCBs in schools, right? Vermont's the first state to require schools to test for PCBs. All of that would be coming through statute. It wouldn't be at the discretion of the Agency of Education. We may be given the funds to administer the funds, but the decisions as to how to go about doing that, the legislature has a big part of doing that. In terms of infrastructure associated with those type of concerns, that's what the whole discussion going on now about school construction programs. School construction was suspended back in 2007. It's never been reinstated ever since. And because towns are struggling with passing local operating maintenance budgets, let alone capital investment bonds, the deterioration of the school facilities is quite severe. So we conducted a school facilities assessment back in 2022, and it ran into 2023. And it identified what we didn't even need a study to tell us, that the schools are sick, the infrastructure is failing, and that we need to do something from a state perspective to reinstate a school construction program. That is totally within the purview of the legislature, and they're actively discussing it. The question becomes, in a state like Vermont, where do you get the revenue? We're talking about on an annual basis, $300 million just to bring schools back up to a level where they're safe, warm, and dry. It has nothing to do with modernizing the schools. And at a time when we're talking about decreasing enrollments, but a growing facility infrastructure need, there's going to have to be a lot of hard decision making going on about where to best invest those funds. Because we're talking, if you're in the news, everything about education transformation is reducing the number size of the school districts, increasing the number of seats being occupied per class. And all of that is to, one, get better education equity across all of the school districts, but to also get economies of scale by right sizing the school system for the size of the state that we are. So they're all interrelated, Victor, and environmental contaminants is something that's certainly in one of the prioritization schemas being considered for when deciding to award construction aid. Does a school have a an environmental contaminant, whether it's asbestos, radon, PCBs, PFAS, take your flavor of the day of what is the contaminant we want to think about. All those are being thought about as construction regulations and rules are going to be coming forward.
Thank you for that clarification.
Great question. If we don't have any other questions, we can move to Agency of Transportation. Let's see. Dave, should we pass it to you?
Yeah, I'll just say hi, and I am gonna pass it over to Colin Smythe, who did the lion's share of the work and kind of coordinated us in AOT, and I'll just hand it right over to him to not take up any more airtime.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Dave. And hi, everybody. Let me just find my couple of slides here. All right. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you. As Dave mentioned, I'm Colin Smythe with the Agency of Transportation. And yeah, so I guess I'll kind of kick it off by saying that our kind of analysis and spending report, I'd say, was probably most similar to Amy's in the Department of Health. So we started off kind of this process by inventorying kind of all the programs within AOT, and we kind of used an existing reporting and tracking framework to do that, and so it kind of matched up nicely with the funding to that framework for those programs. Once we had them inventoried, we kind of reviewed all the individual programs to determine which of those programs kind of provided environmental benefits and which were either kind of a bigger maybe stretch as to whether or not they had an environmental benefit or had no environmental benefit to speak of. So out of those, we picked 3 to kind of dig deep into. And I'll kind of get to this a little bit later in the challenges piece, but we picked 3 because we weren't sure how long it was going to take to really dig into these programs. So we have the financial information for kind of all of the programs, but the 3 programs that we kind of focused on in the report are the ones where we kind of met with the program staff kind of throughout the process and really got very specific data from them and dug in to understand both the data and more about the programs themselves to see, how that funding was actually distributed and what are the nuances behind it. And so I have like a final slide will show kind of a mapping exercise that we did, and that was kind of my attempt to geographically distribute this information. But I'll get there in a minute. But all that was informed through coordination with the 3 programs, and the programs were public transit, it was a clean vehicle incentives, and the bicycle and pedestrian program. So some of the kind of obviously the challenges have been touched on already, but I mentioned the uncertainty around the level of effort. It really depended on the program and the specific data source as to how long it took to actually complete the analyses for these. And some of them were much more straightforward than others. And we had a couple of different data sets generally. We had the kind of higher level financial data, but then we had the program specific data that was, for example, public transit in the form of like 21 different Excel spreadsheets, and had to kind of go through and classify all those. So there was just a big difference in level of effort between the different programs, and it was hard to know without getting really in the weeds on them. So some of them took a lot of effort, and all the data sets, because we have kind of a lot of different programs at the Agency of Transportation. They all have kind of different data sets, and there were some common themes, but a lot of times we had to tie kind of existing kind of geographically located data sets to not geographically located data sets, and that took some level of effort as well. So the other piece that I know has kind of been mentioned already, but is the kind of tying of the funding distribution to the actual environmental benefits that those provided was also a big challenge. And so we just stuck more to the distribution of funding. And at this point, anyway, made the assumption that the benefits would kind of very closely mirror that in terms of the location they were provided. So I'm going to move on to my second slide here so as not to take too much time. I think I am anyway. There we go. So our findings, some of them are a little bit more kind of challenges as well than findings, but in the mapping work, it was interesting to think about how to get the data down to a scale that it would be meaningful, like on a community level. Like the level it was reported at is a much broader geographic scale than kind of a community specific one. And so kind of grappling with how to even think about that was kind of something I came out of this process having a greater appreciation for the kind of trickiness of that. We'll say for a couple of AOT programs, I'm thinking of transit specifically, it was also interesting to think about kind of the trade-off between the total funding spent versus kind of the amount of people. And so again, for transit, it's kind of like you're spending way more money in Chittenden County, but you also have way more people in Chittenden County. And so there's just kind of some interesting trade-offs in terms of how the funding is distributed, whether you should consider population density somehow in those calculations. And so don't have any kind of prescribed way to handle that, but it was just another kind of interesting thing that we came upon or kind of had talked through, thought about in this process. Another interesting piece was that a lot of times, and I noticed this specifically for the bicycle and pedestrian projects, some of these projects are very expensive. And so having just a 3-year window, probably a location, even a town may not get a project within a 3-year window. And so it just felt like kind of an incomplete picture, and understand the limitations of you have to set the window somewhere. But that was another piece where it just kind of made us think about the nuance of that. And kind of similar to a couple other programs that have been mentioned, Bob kind of touched on it a little bit for education. Also interesting to think about how a lot of the AOT programs already have some components of equity built into them. And so not saying it's enough, certainly, but it's at least being considered somehow. And the other part that kind of sort of relates to that is that this kind of gets a little bit at a discretionary funding question. But the last point is that a lot of the funding, at least for the programs like the clean vehicle incentive programs, are applications. And so the agency doesn't really decide on where the money specifically goes, but and those programs as well already have kind of a lower income component built into them. But point being that that funding kind of goes wherever the applicants kind of apply for it. And so that was another one where that one very clearly has an environmental benefit, but is not totally, I guess, discretionary in terms of the agency doesn't decide specifically what location it goes to. So going to jump down. I guess feel like I've been prattling along for a while now, but our kind of next steps are, or kind of lessons learned and next steps, are that coordinating with program staff is very helpful and necessary to understand kind of the nuances of these programs and the more in-depth funding data that I feel is helpful to kind of get these funding distributions at a level that's meaningful. It will be helpful to kind of have the framework that we put together for this report, the baseline report, already kind of there. And so adding more programs in the future, which is kind of the last point, will hopefully be more manageable, meaning that we've kind of already set it up to kind of be able to add additional financial information into this framework. And so we're going to try to kind of add programs as we go forward in the reporting process to the extent we're able. So yes, I'm sorry, I feel like I've been talking fast again, but I'll just move quickly to my last slide, which is kind of just a snapshot of some of the kind of maps I put together from these programs, and certainly these don't have anything to do with environmental justice focused populations. This is just the distribution of the funding, and certainly not trying to kind of usurp the mapping tool that's coming out here. But this is just kind of how, since we have some kind of mapping expertise in the agency, and that we were able to kind of lean on, just our way of understanding this distribution in a visual way. I think that's about all I've got. So Dave, unless you have anything to add or any questions, happy to take them.
No, that's good. That gives a good snap. The maps in particular give a kind of a snapshot of the mechanics of our work and what Colin was digging through with others at the agency for financial information, and maybe does foreshadow a little bit of what can be done, at least in some cases, for programs that are well enough defined and discrete, to kind of show where those investments are going. Thank you.
These visuals are very helpful.
Thanks.
I'm wondering if Colin, if you could explain a little bit what each map is showing, just because it might be difficult for folks to see the legend.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry, they are pretty small, I'm sure.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah. So the farthest to the left one is just public transit funding by county, and so that exercise, and I won't go too deep in the details unless you want me to, but that essentially took kind of the public transit area boundaries, which is where the funding is kind of distributed, and had to kind of break that out into the various counties. And for public transit, there's also the wrinkle of kind of demand response, which is like call for a ride kind of a service versus a fixed route transit service. And so that exercise was trying to put all those together and then kind of aggregate it at the county level. The Clean Transportation Incentive Program one was really just taking kind of the EV or electric vehicle and other kind of clean transportation incentives, and they have that information by town, and so that was just kind of totaling all those incentives by town and kind of attaching it to that town data layer. And then the bicycle and pedestrian one on the right, sorry, the clean transportation's in the middle, bicycle pedestrian on the right, was taking kind of some existing information that was already in kind of the mapping geographic format, and kind of attaching some of our capital program budget information into that, kind of by project, and then just displaying where those specific projects were. And so like identifying the towns where all those specific projects were, and kind of, aggregating the totals by the town.
I'll just jump in and add that the color coding is the key is represented or represents level of investment, and the darker bluish colors are oh, Colin, help me out. Those are the lower amounts, and the
lower.
brighter yellowish colors represent increasing or higher dollar amounts for those that can't read the key.
Yep. Thanks, Dave. Should have.
And the other thing I'll
that.
just add, sorry, Juliet, just one more comment is in the report itself, Colin also developed tables of information to represent what you're seeing on the map. So for people that are wanting to see it maybe in a different format to digest it in a different way, that's available as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Juliet, go ahead.
Thanks, Colin. This is really, really cool. I'm excited to see any sort of visualization of this. So thank you for sharing this. Don't take this as me being like, oh, you should definitely do this. I'm just putting an idea out into the world, which is that it would be really cool to see these maps, but instead of just representing the amount of funding by county, it would be cool to see the proportion of funding per population by county. So like if a county got $2 million, we could see the percent of spending per person within the county. I think that would be a really interesting tool too, because like obviously we've got a lot of spending in it for all of these. It shows that Chittenden County, Rutland, there's also some hubs in like Bennington and Montpelier for a lot of this, but you know, that also is, I think, partially because that's probably where there's more population.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And we did kind of talk about that, but I didn't kind of get there in the end. But I think you're right. That's a really important and potentially helpful way to look at this too.
Thank you. Great work. Oh yeah,
Thanks.
Victor, go ahead.
I have two questions, and I can space them out a bit, which is the first one is at any point were you able to look at whatever the current version of the environmental justice map is and see how these figures overlay with that map? Was there anything of interest that came up to you as far as like correlation was concerned with these things?
I have looked at that data. I did not actually kind of put that data, overlay it on this. And I was considering that, but then with all the work that has been going on with the mapping tool, and that's going to be kind of the official, I guess, layer, for lack of a better term, for that. I didn't go there, but I think it is in a format anyway where that should be pretty easy to do when that EJ mapping tool kind of is finished.
Excellent. My second question was about looking at this map. This is a map of the current funding distribution happening in Vermont, not intended distribution changes. That's what I'm understanding.
Yes.
Is there, with this information, is there an intent to then modify spending within the Department of Transit for Vermont on how to better adjust for balancing out this, or is this like what is the plan for this data? I guess I want to get a more concrete idea.
Yeah, at the moment,
Dave,
I can take that. I mean, at the moment, this is just baseline information to inform ourselves about where the investments are going. And I think maybe Carly can speak can speak to the environmental justice law itself and sort of the intent that it embodies. But for the moment, we're just trying to learn about what we've got going on and where things are being spent.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Victor. So the short and long answer is that these baseline spending reports need to be analyzed by the agencies so that there's clarity with regards to where funds are going with regards to these particular expenditures that were captured, so that then into the future, the agencies are in a position to establish a goal of proportionate distribution. And goal of proportionality is what the statutory language is. So therefore, I'm like doing air quotes. So that's the purpose of this exercise. But at this point, what the agencies concentrated their attention on, which was the mandate in law, is to capture those direct investments that agencies have the discretion to, that they're discretionary funds that provide certain benefits to certain geographic areas. And so that's the information that the agencies captured. The next step will be analyzing the data and coming up with conclusions regarding the spending on these programs. And then later down the line, the law asks for a goal of proportionality.
Thank you for that clarification. Last question. Is there, I would be curious if there's any specific data on kind of density of car ownership in specific districts and regions. Is that available data that you guys have access to? Because that would also, like, when looking at this, when I'm looking at like where public transit funding is going and where pedestrian and bicycle funding is going, I'm wondering how, if those are in areas that do have less dense car ownership, and if that's another part of proportionality that could potentially be considered.
Colin, you're probably better qualified from some of your previous work experiences to answer that. I know there is census data available on that, but I'll let Colin respond directly.
Yeah, I think you're right, Dave. And I don't know, I'm assuming you could get that by census block group, but I think that's probably as kind of fine-grained as that exists, at least that I can think of for a data set. Yeah, I think, like Dave mentioned, I think the census is probably the household survey data is probably where that information would have to come from. And I don't remember now, but I think that's a more kind of specific ask in the census, and so it does not come out like with every release, if I recall, but I can't remember for sure. So, but yes, that is a metric I think that we could probably add in there, at least at some level of granularity. That's a good point.
Colin, if the question doesn't come out with every census release, like if you're correct in that, does that have some sort of impact on the margin of error of the data?
Well, I think that would be, I mean, we didn't incorporate that into this, but I would imagine yes, because it would just be older data like that we'd have to look at, but I'm not clear enough, or I'm not remembering enough like what the actual dates of that kind of release are. I know there was some information that was similar to that either was like an add-on that we paid for one time and are not getting any more to some survey data, but I think there might be some metric like that in the just general census too, but I'd have to look back at it. Sorry to kind of be speculating here.
No, sorry, Colin, I'm asking you to
No, you're fine.
speculate, so it's not your fault.
Not a problem. All right. Any other questions? Great. Well, I guess I will turn it back over here.
Thank you for that. Great questions. Does anyone have any thoughts? Otherwise, I think we're right on time for the agenda. So that's great. But I'll just give some space to see if anyone has anything else to share, and then we'll break for public comment. Is there anyone on the call that's not on the AC or IAC that wants to ask a question or share anything? Let's see. Okay, doesn't look like it. All right, let's take 10 minutes, come back at 11:40, and then we can keep going.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. If everyone is ready, we're gonna continue on with the presentations. I'm gonna put the next order, like the presentation order in the chat so everyone has it.
Okay, Kim, do you want me to just get started?
Sure. Yep.
Okay, I'm also going to do a screen share if I could.
Yep, sounds good.
Let me see here. I'm only on one screen today, so. Let's see here. I'll see them.
Yep.
Can you still see them? I'm sorry, I'm going to see if I can you still see it in display mode?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to give it a try. All right, so yeah, excited to join the ranks of sharing sort of our environmental benefits baseline spending report process. Sure if this is showing in the right way. It's funny. Let's see if I can. I wanted to start by just showing the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets mission, which I think was helpful that other folks shared as well. So our mission is to facilitate, support, and encourage the growth and viability of agriculture in Vermont while protecting the Vermont working landscape, human health, animal health and plant health, as well as consumers and the environment. So that gives you a sense of the collective work that happens across our agency. We're a small enough agency of about 155 folks that we don't have departments, but instead we have 6 divisions. So that's how our organization is structured a little bit differently than some of our other agency partners. Sharing a little bit about the process that we went through. So we created an environmental benefits spending subcommittee at the Agency of Agriculture. That group started meeting in June of 2025. And that had a few representatives across different divisions at the agency. And we used that team, as some of the other folks have shared, to review the various programs that we have. So we started with just like an inventory of the different services and programs that we provide at the Agency of Agriculture. We used the guidance that was provided to help us create our own criteria of how we were going to decide what to include across the various programs and services that our agency offers Vermonters. We made the decision that we were going to use the data that we already had available to us. And so we used our financial reporting system, which we use at the agency, Vision, and that program provides the actual payments that are made to individual businesses through our grants, but doesn't include contracts. So right off the bat, we knew that that was going to be a distinction of what was captured. We wanted to make sure, following the guidance, that we were only considering, of all the services and programs that the Agency of Agriculture offered, those that offered a direct environmental benefit to individuals. So many of our programs have an economic development intent. And so we considered those to be an indirect environmental benefit because their intended purpose was for economic development. Then we wanted to ensure that the investment that was being made was a direct investment to an individual. So money that went to an organization that was then distributed across to other organizations or numerous individuals, we did not capture those. We considered those an indirect investment to Vermonters. And then we wanted to ensure that the investment could be tracked or traced to a specific Vermont location. And so again, we needed that to be a payment that was direct to an individual that we could track in our financial reporting system of Vision. And then, as others have shared, we wanted this not to be part of our one-time appropriations that we may have received through the legislature as a one-time program or through ARPA or IRA investment of federal funds. And so again, we were looking at our typical programs and investments received at the agency. So what that turned out was we reviewed 45 programs and efforts across the agency. We identified that 11 of those programs qualified as we interpreted the guidance for this reporting process. And then we took all those programs and we organized them by the categorized environmental benefit types. And within the Agency of Agriculture, we had those 11 programs were most directly associated with the two environmental benefit categories of clean air, water, and land, or safe, nutritious food. So the quick kind of assessment across the 3 fiscal years of fiscal year 23, 24, and 25 was that based on that criteria, as we just described, we had $26.5 million as an agency that was directed in environmental benefit investments across that 3-year period. When looking at each of the 3 years, 23, 24, and 25 separately, it was between $8 and $9 million approximately invested annually. And that was to individuals or organizations across 193 towns. So what that meant was that we primarily captured grants to farms that were associated directly with an environmental benefit and that they received that direct funding. What that meant that was not captured in this was programs that were focused on economic impact, as I mentioned, statewide or regional environmental benefit investments, because we couldn't pinpoint that to a specific Vermont location or to an individual. And then a majority of the technical assistance and the regulatory compliance work that our agency does was also not captured in this inventory. And one of the learned lessons, and we'll talk about that in a later slide, is that we recognize that much of our agency's work is in about 80% of the work that our agency does is in the compliance and enforcement arena. So then we started, so we had all of that data captured by our business office, probably done by October. And then the process was we needed to share that information with leadership. We needed to start working on the narrative interpretation of the results, create a website so that information could be more publicly accessible, and then decide how we really wanted to accessibly represent the results. And that was an important part to our team, especially given the intent behind the EJ law, was that we didn't want the information to be too overwhelming and too confusing for the various audiences. We wanted to ensure that we were protecting personally identifying information in any of our reporting of the results. We wanted to make sure that the data was organized in a way that was really digestible for people to be able to manipulate the data and play with it and sort of seek out what it was that they were particularly interested in. So we ended up deciding to create an Agency of Agriculture Environmental Justice webpage, which had not existed at the Agency of Agriculture previously. We also decided that we wanted to do some visualization of the data. And so I can share that, but we decided to do both some pivot tables that allowed people to sort of anyone to be able to sort the data by program, by environmental benefit type, by year, by county, by geography. And then we had some existing data that we could do similar to AOT, some data visualization across the state of where investments were made from a impact radius perspective. We also, as an agency, felt like it was really important to do a nod to the amount of inspection and compliance work that our agency does. And so we actually included in our report a full appendix that summarized the programs and services that didn't qualify per our interpretation of the criteria for inclusion in this report, but we wanted to use this as an opportunity to say that this agency still does a lot of environmental benefit work. It just may not have qualified for inclusion in the calculation of this baseline report. So if you take a look at our report, you'll see there's a whole section of non-qualified inspection technical assistance and granting programs captured in the report. Let's see. So under kind of lessons learned, actually maybe before, yeah, I think that's fine. We did include non-discretionary funds in the report, acknowledging that kind of like Bob said around Agency of Education and others identified, most of our resources are from federal funding or through state appropriation, and we don't have a lot of discretion around how those resources are spent. This sort of like captured typically in statute. We also learned that this was the time period where much of the work in the Agricultural Development Division, which is actually the division that I work in, were one-time funding. So there was a lot of U.S. Department of Agriculture, new state dollars, and federal American Rescue Plan Act dollars that were made as investments in the agency at that time. And again, most of those were not captured in this data poll. We did also just acknowledge that we do make a lot of investments to private businesses. And so those are mostly the data that was captured in this baseline report. The impact radius was something that was really complex for us to consider. And we really didn't feel that we had the currently available tools or systems to really accurately assess this across all of our quantifiable programs. But we had a few examples that we captured on the website and in the report where we did have available data to quantify, like food may have been distributed to a food bank or to a particular entity, and we knew what their distribution radius was. And so in that way, we were able to identify both a direct environmental investment that was made and also kind of like the area of impact, the impact radius that was associated with that. As others have shared, and as the cover letter, also reiterated, looking at and inventorying the programs, pulling the data, doing a fair amount of preparation of the data of what was truly quantifiable, and then figuring out how to discuss this and share this in a really transparent but also accessible way was a really time-consuming task for those 3 fiscal years. And we don't have the number of hours that were invested because that's not something that our agency currently tracks, but we know that it was time of 6 staff across 8 months. And on many occasions, it was probably 30 to 50% of that FTE per week spent working on this task for at least a period of time within those 8 months. And I think to that point, it was really important for our agency to spend some time really thinking about how the direct environmental benefits and investments were situated within the work of the Agency of Agriculture, but the investment of staff and capacity that was committed over this 8-month period really doesn't feel like we have the sustainability for that. We also, like, logistically have a big part of our team that are considered limited service positions, which means they're funded with very specific dollars, and a lot of those dollars are shifting and changing as a result of the loss of the federal funds that our agency and programs have experienced over the past couple of since January. So just a few more slides I just wanted to share. This is one of the outcomes. So this is the web page that was created for environmental justice. So I'm not expecting that you would necessarily read this, but you can sort of see that we created a homepage and then 3 widgets that relate to the 3 primary deliverables related to EJ. So one being the, access to environmental benefits, which is where this baseline report, the pivot tables, and the Power BI kind of maps, heat maps are. Then the middle widget is public feedback and input. That's where the community engagement efforts would be captured on our website. And then the third widget is equitably sharing environmental burdens. And under that section is where currently the civil rights and environmental justice complaint reports are posted. So this is the first time that our agency had shared any of this information publicly. So that was all as of the March 10th date. Just really quickly, I don't know if it's of interest to advisory council members to just be able to see what some of the results looked like and how we categorized it. This is just one way. It's not necessarily the right way or the best way, but we did 3 different tables that we included in the report to kind of summarize the data as best we thought was valuable. So this first table, table 1, shows the investments by program that are organized by environmental benefit type. So you can see the clean air, water, and land is in the light purple, and the nutritious food is in the light blue. And then you can see across the 3 fiscal years what the investments were by program, by environmental benefit type, and in total. Table 3 was, we wanted to kind of like put this into some degree of context, and other folks have asked questions and agencies and entities have talked about kind of context around their data. We wanted to try to show what kind of like proportion of these environmental benefit investments were of the entire agency's base budget each of the 3 years. So you can see the fiscal year 23, 24, and 25 data that shows what our quantifiable investments were, broken out by environmental benefit type, and then the remainder being the non-quantifiable investments as an agency. So just thought that that could be of interest to some if they wanted to understand a little bit more context around the data. And then this table, table 2, was our geographic representation. And we chose to do it by county because we made investments in 193 towns over those 3 years. Like, that didn't feel like a very accessible chart of information. We don't obviously have the mapping tool yet or the census block information available. So we rolled it up into counties. And so you can see by county, by environmental benefit type, across the 3 fiscal years, what our environmental benefit investments were. What I think was interesting and a takeaway for us that kind of feels like it's working towards this environmental benefits focused population, environmental justice focused population, is that our greatest investments are made in, not surprisingly, but kind of reassuringly, in our primary ag counties. So Franklin, Addison, and Orleans counties, not our most populated counties in Vermont of, say, Chittenden, Washington, and Rutland counties. So while we don't have kind of like the full census block tracking, we were at least able to like sense check, did these investments make sense given kind of the work and nature of the Agency of Agriculture. And then the last slide, just very briefly, thinking of what the next steps are, and everyone has already mentioned, preparing that proportionality plan by July. I really find this advisory council sort of request for us to share the results with you really meaningful, because I think we've all used different processes, even though we had similar guidance. I think it's really, we're really open to the feedback that we might receive on whether we followed the guidance as expected, and on the accessibility of the report and the data that we've shared, and if there's any improvements or changes that we should make in our process and reporting. Going forward, one of the things that I think was also reiterated by our presentation of this is that we all used somewhat different vocabulary and processes around what was included in the reports. And I think that can make it challenging to come all. And then really ideally, I'd love to see us look at some exploration of some uniform metrics. Again, like, is it important to know environmental benefits per program, or by town, or across all programs, or, by environmental benefit type, those types of data points that we chose to kind of capture in our report, but I don't know if that's what's feeling most important to everyone. So that's it from Agency of Agriculture. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Abby. That was wonderful.
Sure.
I just want to give some space to see if advisory council members have any questions.
Was that helpful? Like, did that give like a better sense of kind of like what the task was, and how at least one version of it, how an agency, an entity approached it?
Hi, this is Brittany. I found it helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome, Brittany.
Yeah, I think obviously going through this the second time now, and it's still early. It's been really hard to find ways to approach this, angles of approach, and I think the agencies are doing what they can. Yeah.
Thanks, Rich.
All right, am I up?
Yeah, I think you're up.
Hi, Grace Vincent, Environmental Officer at ACCD here. Very hard to follow you, Abby. I just have a few quick slides, so I'm going to share my screen. Oh gosh, I can't see anyone now. So if
Yeah, I'll let you know if anyone has. Yeah, we
Okay.
can see you and we
Cool.
can see your slides, and I'll let you know if anyone has their hand up or anything.
Awesome. It's just 2 slides, so it'll be quick. So I work at ACCD, the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. We're one of the covered agencies. Our mission is pretty straightforward. We help Vermonters improve their quality of life and build strong communities. So right there, you can see that a lot of our programs and initiatives have environmental benefits. So for the purposes of the report, for our baseline spending report, we looked at the hierarchy of ACCD and sort of split it out as this flowchart shows. So there's ACCD, and then there's 4 sort of departments, I guess, for lack of a better word: Department of Housing and Community Development, Department of Economic Development, and then Department of Tourism and Marketing. And then we also have Historic Preservation. So those 4 divisions are the main divisions we looked at. And then within DHCD, we looked at 3 divisions within DHCD, which was Vermont Community Development Program, Community Planning and Revitalization, and Housing. And these are all spelled out in the report, but I just wanted to give that overview of how we're sort of structured. So this is just our very high-level summary slide. So our report process was led by me, the environmental officer, and the environmental specialist, similar to what was discussed in the other presentations. we didn't have a lot of staff capacity or time to dedicate alone to this report, and I did not have the authority or I didn't have the authority to sort of redirect any staff time. So that was a big challenge in terms of just me and Becca Walsh, who's the environmental specialist, sort of being responsible for pulling this whole thing together. One thing that really helped was the other covered agencies submitting, the templates that Abby submitted and stuff like that. But I just wanted to flag that this first year was a big lift because it was just the two of us and we were, developing the template. So our process was we looked at all the programs that could be exported from Vision, which is our main financial system, as some other agencies use. We have a interesting range of programs in terms of how the money is dispersed or how it's even allocated. We have some one-time programs that the general fund or the state house sort of says, here ACCD, here's a pilot program, but it's just for this year. So we have some of those. We have a lot of annual grant programs that we allocate funding to municipalities from. But then we also have the Department of Economic Development, which is very different and sort of provides more direct incentives or business incentives and tax incentives as well. So we met with program staff and said, what are your programs that provide a direct environmental benefit? And again, program staff were limited in their capacity. So, some of them did contribute information, but DED in particular, Department of Economic Development, did not have basically any capacity to contribute to the development of this report. So that's sort of a big information gap, I would say. Becca and I used our own discretion in deciding what programs to include and what benefits those programs had. So that's a department that has less programmatic data than you'll see in other programs. So backing up, I missed a step. First, we met with our financial program staff and they said, sure, we can get you the data from Vision, but we just need the program list. That's when we then met with the program staff to identify that program list. We took it back to our financial staff. They got us the raw financial data, and then we sort of formatted it into the report that we submitted. So that was our process. And then in terms of environmental benefits, we found that our programs had 5 major benefits, and that's outlined on this slide. So obviously a lot of our programs are focused around either rehabbing housing or new construction of housing. So healthy homes and buildings is a big one that our programs, that healthy homes and buildings is a big benefit that our programs provide. Training and funding, like I said, we have a lot of annual grants that we distribute either to municipalities through a competitive program, or we also distribute grants to regional planning commissions. So those provide an environmental benefit in terms of distributing training and funding. Public transportation, we have a lot of those programs, including, the Downtown Transportation Fund is an example of one. Clean renewable energy, the CPNR, which is Community Planning and Revitalization, has a specific environmental or a specific electric vehicle infrastructure program that they're partnering with VTrans on, I believe, to sort of actually set up EV charging infrastructure throughout Vermont. So that's cool. And then fulfilling and dignified green jobs, I would say those are more for the DED program. So an example of one of those is the state trade expansion program. So that's our basic process. Oh, and I'm going to put in the chat a link to our report on the EJ SharePoint. But any questions? Sorry, I'll just add one more thing for context. This is sort of outlined in the report, but one thing Becca and I sort of struggled with in terms of housing money is a lot of these housing projects, require dozens, if not more, funding sources, and our funding source is a small part of that project, but it's sort of the lever that allows the project to go forward. So in future years, we want to sort of showcase that more in terms of like, what did our funding allow to, be built, if that makes sense.
Great job, Grace and Becca. You all did really awesome work here. You all came a good way, so we're proud of you. Does anyone else have questions or thoughts, feedback? Okay. If not, we can move on to public safety.
All right, thank you, Kim. Let me share my screen. I have a couple of slides. They're very simple and basic, so just wanted to give people something to look at as I talk through this. So, hi everybody. So I'm Stephanie Smith. I'm the Deputy Director at Vermont Emergency Management. So I'm in one of the divisions of the Department of Public Safety, which the primary divisions are Vermont State Police, VEM where I work, the Forensics Lab, and the Division of Fire Safety. So those are the big divisions that fall under public safety. We reviewed 44 distinct funding programs. So that was any of the any programs that were received and were putting out funding during the 3-year look back period. So I met with our finance staff, had them put together the list of what those programs were, the high level provision that they could pull on the programs and the financials for the full list of programs, and then worked with the program managers within every section for any of the funding programs to get an overview of what the program was, what they used it for, what they used the funding for, whether it would meet the requirements here. So we landed on 3 programs that have distinct environmental benefits. And similar to other agencies, we were looking at a bunch of different things which are outlined in a spreadsheet in the report, such as whether they're discretionary or not. So if the state is actually deciding what to fund, or if we're funding what we're told to fund. If it's direct funding, so our report, like a lot of the others for this first round, really focuses on that direct funding that's going to a project and not funding for staff time. And funding that's reoccurring. So similarly to some of these others, like Abby spoke about with ARPA funding, we've got programs that were one-time pots so that we've received a little bit of funding in, but really focusing on what are those programs that we're receiving over time so that we can really push how we allocate that funding. The programs, so we addressed 3 programs in greater detail. The rest of the programs, they're all included in the report with a quick overview of what the program is, and based on our review, why it ended up not being addressed in the report in detail. So of those 44 million, we're talking about $461 million. The 3 programs addressed in detail over this 3-year period, the funding under those programs that was direct was about 11.6 million. And that's not allocated funding, that's funding that actually went out the door during that period. So a lot of these are projects that are in process, where especially funding following the flooding in 2023 and 24, which I'll get into in a little bit more detail. Those projects are started based on the end of this period, but a lot of work happened directly following that. So some of the projects, this is just the beginning of that project. And then the document includes a full list of all of the projects that received any funding during this period. So a piece of that project, even though it's not done, and it'll still be continuing in future years. So what's the funding that has actually been spent on work already? Okay. So the 3 programs that rose to the level of meeting the requirements based on our review were all funded programs that were funded with FEMA dollars that are managed by Vermont Emergency Management under our hazard mitigation program. So there's 3 main buckets of that. One is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. That's funding that directly follows federally declared disasters in the state. So based on the scale of a federally declared disaster, we get a certain amount of money for immediate needs, for public infrastructure, for that sort of work. And then in addition to that, based on the scale, we get funding to use in our hazard mitigation program. And I'll explain a little more about that too. But that's really the hazard mitigation grant program. So in following the flooding in 2023, that was the largest pot of funding we have ever seen. But we've had funding almost every year since 2011 to some degree in that program, but it changes based on the disasters that we're seeing. The second category is pre-disaster mitigation funding. So there's different programs that fall under this one code within our system. We get some congressional directed spending, which that is non-discretionary. We don't get to decide how to spend that. We're told how to. BRIC, which is the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. And then what predated that program is the pre-disaster mitigation program. So that's all lumped into this PDM bucket. And that's annual funding. So usually we have a small amount of funding we can spend every year that's allocated across the country. We get a small piece, and then there's the opportunity to apply for much larger competitive projects. And based on the competitive criteria, we have not been successful so far in applying for those larger dollars. So this ends up being a fairly small amount of money each year. And then the flood mitigation, oh, I pulled up BRIC on here. The last one addressed in the report is the flood mitigation assistance Swift Current program, which is also disaster-based, but we received that following flooding in 23 and 24. And it's a little bit more of a one-time pot, but because we have a little bit of year over year and we are addressing these others, we included that as well. Okay, so I talked about hazard mitigation funding, but just to take a quick step back on what this high level of what we're looking at, hazard mitigation funding is used to reduce our future long-term risk. So predominantly what we're doing is addressing flood hazards and using the funding proactively to give the river space to access its floodplain when water is high. The intent is really to remove risk before it happens. So we're reducing long-term vulnerability. The reality is, based on that hazard mitigation grant program pot that I talked about, the majority of our funding comes after a disaster. So that's when we actually have funding available. And the project types, so this is the sort of stuff that we fund under these different programs. The majority of what we're funding are property buyouts, floodplain restoration projects where we're removing fill, restoring floodplains so that the river can access its floodplains, and upsizing infrastructure like bridges and culverts. This is a landslide buyout. That was one of the ones that we purchased a few years ago. So the report includes a map of where all funding was allocated across Vermont under these programs. Often those are focused in communities that have experienced flooding in the past because that's where the interest is in doing this work. And the report also gives an overview of our project review committee, who's on it, how they make decisions around what projects get funded. And predominantly that's funding that goes to municipalities. So governmental entities are eligible as sub-applicants for this funding. And then other people today have talked a little bit about this need for the difference between direct and indirect funding. One of the future considerations we're looking at in particular for this report is how we address that indirect spending. So it's not addressed in detail in this report. The example I'll give you is FEMA's public assistance program. So when we have those federally declared disasters, public assistance pays for emergency needs on the ground when a disaster is happening, but predominantly for replacing infrastructure, upsizing culverts and bridges that were damaged, removing debris, repairing public buildings and infrastructure. So in the case of a program like this is the vast majority of the funding that comes through DPS as a whole is through this program. And we're not controlling what we fund. It's determined by what's damaged in a flood event, but because it's based on those damages. But we do control our own technical assistance, what we're doing between disasters to ensure that communities are prepared, how we're supporting communities following a disaster. So that's the sort of stuff that is a lot squishier, doesn't get captured here under that indirect category, but is something that we'd like to address better going forward. So that's what I had. I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Any questions? Okay. let's go to Claire. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Kim. I went rogue, I guess maybe with the exception of Jenny, and I do not have slides. I just thought I would talk through at a high level some of like the core highlights from our report, which really, I think our report covers a lot of what's already been talked about, like who the department is, what our work area is, the process we took to conduct this analysis, what we understood the requirements to be, and then some core findings, which I'll highlight briefly today. And then we have an appendix, which I'll also talk through in terms of some of the programs that we identified as meeting some of the criteria for the baseline spending report, but not enough of the criteria to consider them as like a baseline assessment for where we might want to think about directing investments in the future. So just to start with the Department of Public Services, and I should say I'm Claire McElvany. I work in one of our 9 divisions. But the work of the Department of Public Service, we're a standalone department. We don't sit within a broader agency and state government, but we really work in the areas of energy, telecommunications, and some limited water and wastewater energy services. So we do a lot of planning around those areas for the state, in addition to public advocacy and regulatory work specific to the largely utility services that are being offered in those areas. And we very occasionally deliver public-facing programs, which I'll talk through in a minute. We have roughly 60 employees, so we're relatively small in 9 divisions, like I mentioned, and our typical operating budget is about $12 million, plus any federal or one-time funds that we may receive above and beyond that. And when I think about the work of the department and the environmental benefits that were named in the environmental justice law, the ones that really, I think, resonate the most with the work we do is advancing affordable and clean renewable energy, healthy homes and businesses through some of the work we advocate for example, through weatherization services, and fulfilling and dignified green jobs. So we do some work in workforce development as well. And then there are other areas of our work that aren't explicitly named as an environmental benefit in the law, but I think still technically qualify under the broader definition, like supporting energy efficiency of buildings, making sure we have resilient and reliable grid infrastructure in the state, and then things like making sure we have access, equitable access to adaptive telecommunications technologies or other energy infrastructure. So kind of a high-level overview of the department. And our process to conduct this work is very similar to those that others have talked through. So I work directly with each of our divisions to better understand their scope of work, which actually was really interesting. I don't know if others felt this way, but I feel like we can get so siloed even in a tiny department. It was fun to like check in and learn and help like cross some of those silos and think about how we can work together more collaboratively going forward. But we had kind of 3 core criteria that we were looking to identify programs that fall under, those that directly invested funds in work areas that delivered direct environmental benefits, and that obviously those direct investments fell within the 3-year reporting period. And then for any programs we identified, we went through kind of a list of filters to see what would qualify for including in like a baseline assessment of our spending over those 3 years that we were thinking about. And that was things like discretionary versus non-discretionary funds, one-time versus recurring funds, availability of data like others have talked about. And our report highlights kind of 3 core things that came out of that inventory. And I don't know if anyone actually mentioned it, but the guidance that was issued had kind of included 2 core components of this reporting. There was the qualitative kind of narrative reports around all the process work, and then a data inventory that we interpreted to be like programs that met the inclusion for like a baseline investment period. And we ended up determining that there were no programs that we ran that qualified to be included in that baseline assessment. And so we only had a narrative report, which is different from some agencies. And that really stems from the 3 findings I wanted to just highlight and talk through briefly today. The first was that, as I mentioned, we occasionally run public facing kind of direct investment programs, but really the bulk of the department's work occurs through indirect investments of staff time. So we have historically not run very many like kind of public facing direct investment like incentives and grant programs. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but a lot of our work is really staff time based, and that was optional to report on this in this round, but also would be really challenging for us to do with the current systems we have at a very precise level. So it was just kind of a big finding as we like talk through all the divisions. And then related to that, sort of the second big piece is that a lot of that staff time focuses on our regulatory work. I think like Abby had highlighted, and I know others have talked about, which again really focuses on evaluating and at times regulating the work of the utilities in Vermont. So all of our gas and our one gas and all of our electric utilities, our efficiency utilities, and then other types of work. And so that's like looking at, are the rates that electric utilities in Vermont charging their customers, are they reasonable? And then advocating at times before the Public Utility Commission about whether or not they are just and reasonable, and if not, how they should be adjusted. And in a lot of that work, we don't have direct authority to direct the way that utilities spend their money. It's really an advocacy role. So that was a big, I think, theme that came up when we were evaluating the scope of our work, and a big uncertainty as to whether or not that kind of regulatory work would really fall in this reporting requirement, because again, it's where we conduct a lot of advocacy, but we don't always directly influence or have control over the decision that is made about how utilities spend their money. So that's an area I think for future work for us is as we dive deeper into this, and potentially one where some clarity could be helpful in terms of guidance moving forward if there's similarities in other agencies. And then the last finding I wanted to highlight was that we did identify a couple programs within 2 of our divisions, the State Energy Office and our Telecommunications Division, that met those kind of 3 core baseline criteria of making direct investments that delivered direct environmental benefits in the reporting period, but that we chose to exclude from our quantitative baseline for a couple reasons. The first was that all of the telecommunications programs were considered non-discretionary. So like many others have mentioned, they're directed in statute. They're not often even included in our base operating budget, and they're funded by an external funding source. So we chose to exclude them for that reason. And then, as many others have touched on, the programs in our State Energy Office are all one-time funded, largely through federal funding, and sometimes through other one-time pots of money. And so, like I highlighted, the department hasn't historically run a lot of those public-facing programs. And I think this recent kind of phase with COVID relief and then the Biden administration's focus on energy and climate funding has really shifted that in a big way. And as others have teed up, is just very uncertain about whether or not it will continue going forward. So we talked a lot about the pros and cons of including some of those investments in a detailed report. One of the pros being that any programs we run in our current structure will likely be one-time funded. So there's definitely an argument for saying we should include some of them in a report like this. But the other con, which we ended up kind of carried the weight, was that it's just so uncertain about the future of those funding sources that it didn't feel accurate to build a baseline that would then influence the way we invest funding in the future based on those fundings. So what we decided to do in that realm was take kind of a middle ground. And actually, I think Abby mentioned this. This is the one thing I'll share. If I can pull it up quickly, which is that our report does include a program appendix where we at least tried to summarize each of those programs that we excluded and offered. Hopefully what you're seeing is my report and not something else I accidentally shared with you, but you know, a short description of the program, the types of services it offers, like, for example, incentives to upgrade your home heating equipment, or a subscription to a community solar array that will give you a discount on your electric bill, what benefit the program delivers, why we chose to exclude it from a quantitative baseline, and then we did provide the high level fiscal year investment. So we did provide at least some data on the program. So yeah, that is my brief summary of our baseline spending report, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Great job, Quinn.
Right, should I go?
Yep.
Jump last to go. All right. Well, thanks everyone for hanging in with all these presentations. I'm Elizabeth Schilling with the Vermont Public Utility. The Commission regulates the public utilities in the state of Vermont. We're a small entity. We have less than 30 full-time staff. So like the Land Use Review Board, the Commission does not make direct investments. We don't administer grants or loans or make any payments. We have a budget with de minimis discretionary spending. The majority of our budget goes towards staff compensation. And staff don't dedicate significant time to providing indirect investments like technical assistance, capacity building, education, outreach, or service provision. A lot of those roles are fulfilled by the Department of Public Service, and Claire just went over some of their work. So most of the Commission's work is the product of utility or developer petitions related to renewables development or utility rate cases. And in those instances, the Commission is operating much like a court. They're a lot like a case, and there are parties and testimony and evidence. And the Commission staff, who are hearing officers in those cases, can only communicate with parties through formal processes. And that's why we don't have significant indirect investments, and those aren't tracked. So despite that, the Commission went and reviewed the Vermont statutes to identify utility programs that we regulate, where the legislature has dictated that utility customers should have equitable opportunities to participate in and benefit from that programming, which is consistent with the EJ goal of proportionate spending on environmental justice focused populations. So we identified two program areas. That was the energy efficiency utility program spending on residential customers, and the electric distribution utility spending on Vermont Renewable Energy Standard Tier 3 energy transformation projects for residential customers. So those programs provide money for things like weatherization, heat pumps, and other beneficial electrification, such as incentives for EVs and other electrical equipment. So the utilities specifically report on that residential spending, and then within that, there are specific metrics and goals for program spending on customers with low income. And as you all know, individuals with low income are included within the definition of environmental justice focused population. So we hope that the continued tracking and reporting on this spending will help to meet that goal of proportionate spending in EJ focused populations. And while we don't have the geographic data on where that spending is happening, we know that large portions of the spending are going towards customers with low income. I didn't have any slides either. Sorry about that. Happy to take any question.
Oh, no.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Someone at Catamount has something to share?
Never mind. I think I just pressed the wrong button.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay. All right. So this was wonderful. I think we should just take like 5 minutes, cameras off, just to, regroup a little bit. There's a lot of information shared. We are super appreciative to advisory council members for being here. And thank you to all of the IEC members who presented. But just want to give us 5 minutes to clear our heads and then move forward together. Let's do that. All right. Carla or Juliet, do you have anything to share before we move on?
Yes, thank you. This is Carla in the Catamount Room at the Agency of Natural Resources. And I would like to first thank you, the Advisory Council, for their feedback in when we were reviewing the environmental benefit spending guidance. That was really helpful for us to shape what these reports now look like. And I also would like to share my gratitude with you all of the interagency committee members, the work that you've done, the time that you've put towards gathering the information, having conversations with program staff, with your leadership, with management teams, then taking all of that data and capturing it and writing this report. It's been a Herculean task, and it's been a great learning lesson for me, I hope for all of us, and also is a great testament to what can be done if there's the will. We accomplished a lot with very little. Now, that is not to say that this is sustainable. I think, something that we should continue raising awareness around is the lack of resources, how underfunded this work is, and the opportunities that exist to communicate this broadly to the General Assembly and beyond. But I just wanted to take time to thank you all for the magnificent work you've done. Even those agencies that do not really fall squarely under the framework that the law is speaking to, the PUC, the PSD, and the LERB. Thank you very much for all of your work.
Great. Okay, so now we're going to move on to finishing up the meeting. I'm going to share my screen for one last slide and then pass it to you, Juliet.
Thanks, Kim. All right. This has been.
Oh, it didn't share at the right spot. One sec.
No worries. I'll just say a couple things before the screen shares. This has been a really, from my perspective at least, and I hope that folks feel the same way. I feel like this was a really enlightening meeting. Despite how much time our unit has spent talking with so many of these agencies to prepare for these reports, I feel like I'm constantly learning new things. Obviously, I don't work for you guys, so there's always more to learn. And so I just really, I feel very connected to you all in having gotten some of the nitty-gritty details of this reporting process. And I really appreciate everybody for kind of holding out and sitting through this meeting, because I think it was really valuable, albeit long. There's a lot of information. But with that said, kind of in the spirit of feeling connected to each other, or finding ways to be in closer relationships with each other in this work, I think that it's a really valuable part of this work that especially advisory council members have acknowledged over and over again that's sort of missing. Like, we need more opportunities to connect with folks on the other side of the aisle, or whatever we want to call it, in the other committee, so that we can feel like we know what direction we're going in, and we know the people we're working with, and we're building allyship and trusting relationships. So that brings us to this slide and our last point for the day, which is these working on excellence partnerships, or WOEs. If you're familiar with this acronym, it comes from Adrienne Marie Brown. and her book Emergent Strategy. Our coworkers, Ricarda Erickson from the Department of Public Service and Sarah McElvenny from the Agency of Agriculture very generously offered some of their time to help us revamp what we've been calling the buddy system for the last couple of years, and see if we can get some partnerships set up so that folks can work with people on the other committee or council, get to know each other and start working on excellence. So basically, we have a lot of information we'd love to continue sharing with you about these partnerships. If you haven't yet filled out the survey that's in your email to indicate if you're interested in working with somebody else from the other council or committee, please do so. We'd love to get you paired with someone who piques your interest. If you have already filled out your survey, which Amy, yes, you have. Don't bother filling it out again. We've read the results, and Sarah and Ricarda are planning to reach out very soon with an email with more information, introducing you to your partner, or in some cases, your group, and get you guys started. So just basically letting you guys know, this is an opportunity at your disposal. If you have time and you're interested, please take advantage of this opportunity. And if you've already filled out the survey, expect to see some information in your inbox. But yeah, looking forward to seeing how these partnerships could help, advance our work and make us feel more connected with each other. Yeah, Carla.
I would like to add, for those folks who have concerns regarding capacity, which I assume are the majority of us here, the great thing about the framework that's being developed and thought through is that it will allow each of the pairs or the groups that are working together to come up with their own cadence of meetings, the topics of conversation, and the pace of work. So it is really flexible. I think the intention is to strengthen relationships between interagency committee members and advisory council members, and also bring in advisory council members into our agencies so that there's a better understanding of some of the limitations and challenges and where opportunities exist to continue embedding environmental justice. Additionally, I think it's particularly cool that we have the opportunity to hear from folks who do this work on a daily basis and perhaps inform differently the way we do our work at our agencies. Anyway, just sharing that, again, there's great flexibility in the amount of meetings, in the content of your conversations, and how you all are going to work with each other.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a really key point. So yeah, closing out, if you're interested, let us know. We'd love to get you set up with a partner.
Abby?
Can I just ask another question? I love the idea of the WOEs, and I think that'll be a really nice way to connect with the advisory council membership and the IAC membership. I guess I have two maybe related questions. One, are we going to talk about the proportionality plan at the next IAC meeting? And if yes, I'm curious if AC members, like if there's an opportunity to include them in the conversation. Like I love, again, I love that we used today to kind of like share the process that each agency and covered entity went through.